And we are recording. Hi, welcome everyone to Summer Fiction Book Club Part 2. And welcome back to those of you who joined us for our first session. So you have arrived, and today we'll be discussing Future Home of the Living God by renowned author Louise Erdrich. My name is Madeline Bougeot-Hart, and my pronouns are she, her, and I serve as Program Associate of the BTS Center, and I'm super happy to welcome you all today. I'm glad to be joined today by our Chaplaincy Initiative Coordinator, Alison Cornish, as well as our guest, oh, there she is, hi, Alison, our guest conversationalist, Reverend Stephanie Perdew. Hi, Stephanie. The BTS Center, for those of you who are not familiar, is the organizational successor to the Bangor Theological Seminary, and we're located in Portland, Maine, on lands long stewarded by the Wabanaki, the people of the Don. We seek to catalyze spiritual imagination with enduring wisdom for transformative faith leadership and are focused on spiritual leadership for a climate-changed world. I'd like to extend a special welcome to all of you joining us live today. Thank you so much for making the time in the middle of your day, as well as a warm hello to those of you who may be watching the recording. At this point, I'd love to invite you to put your digital name tag on, indicating how you'd like to be known in the space, and say hello to our fellow Summer Fiction Book Club readers in the chat. So to do that, I've got a couple questions for you. The first is, where are you logging in from today? I'm in York, Maine. Illinois, great. Massachusetts, another Mainer. California, Iowa, whoa, Florida. We're all over the place. Cool. That's the best part about Zoom. We can all be here together. Portland, great. Feel free to keep dropping in where you're logging in from. And my second question to you is, this one's a doozy. Name a feeling that you experienced while reading this book. I had many feelings, but name one and put it in the chat. Montreal, great. Anxiety and terror. Sure, confusion, fear, dread. Yeah, moved and disturbed. Hope, cool. Familiarity, disappointment, fear, some joy. Yeah, a complicated book to say the least. We're in for a journey. Curious, and another curious and unsettled. Thank you. My last question to you all, and again, feel free to keep going with these questions. It's not a stopper, it's an invitation to continue, is sort of a logistical question for me, as I will ultimately be putting you in breakout rooms. But how far did you get into reading Future Home of the Living God? Did you finish the book? Are you almost finished? Or are you hoping to read it sometime in the future? So if you want to just pop that in the chat so I can see how to best group you at a later time, I'd super duper appreciate it. Thank you. And while you continue to answer these questions, feel free to continue. And thank you again for showing up to this space and for choosing to spend time with us today with this particular group of people to discuss Future Home of the Living God. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our host, Alison.
Thanks so much, Madeline, and welcome, welcome, welcome. Bookworms, bibliophiles, casual readers of summer fiction. I'm so glad to be gathered together with you today. My name is Alison Cornish, and my pronouns are she and her, and I serve as the Chaplaincy Initiative Coordinator at the BTS Center. And I'd love to say more about that for anyone who is curious about what that actually means. As we begin our time together, I invite you, like you may when you're reading a book, to find a comfortable position. Maybe you'd like to light a candle or do something to kind of set this time apart. Maybe you want to grab a favorite drink or whatever else may feel book clubbish to you. I have my glass of ice water here and my trusty notebook for notes, and maybe you two have those accoutrements at hand. So the Summer Fiction Book Club here at the BTS Center is based on the idea that good stories do something that we so need right now. These books reveal present realities, really, really true for this particular book, and imagine possible futures, some dystopian and some hopeful. So fiction both names hard truths and also serves as a window through which we can glimpse compelling and creative visions of social, ecological, political, and economic possibilities. Through a good story, the voices of the marginalized, the silenced, or the forgotten speak their own truth to power. And they can also give witness to the experiences shared by human and other than human communities most affected by climate change in all places. Because we live in a time of profound spiritual and ecological crises, the multi-species world needs spiritual practitioners and leaders who understand that a just transformation is possible when better stories are told and received. That's why we're here. So as Madeline shared this month, we have been reading The Imaginative Tale of Future Home of the Living God, written by Pulitzer Prize winner Louise Erdrich. Now, Future Home of the Living God paints a startling portrait of a young woman fighting for her life and her unborn child against oppressive forces that manifest in the wake of a cataclysmic event. And even if you only got a couple of chapters into the book, I think you already know that part about this tale. In some ways, it's a chilling dystopian novel, both provocative and prescient. And it's an original work from one of our most acclaimed writers. It's a moving meditation on female agency and self-determination and biology and natural rights that speaks to the troubling changes of our time that we're experiencing right now. So before we begin, here's a really quick overview of our gathering today. In this first segment, we'll hear from our guest conversationalist, the Reverend Stephanie Perdew, about the insights and impacts of Future Home of the Living God. And then we're going to move into breakout groups and provide discussion prompts to guide your small group. And after these breakouts, we'll return as the full group, and you'll have an opportunity to ask Stephanie and myself your questions about the book. So now I'm really excited to introduce our guest conversationalist, the Reverend Stephanie Perdew. Stephanie is an ordained UCC minister who serves as director of the Damascus Project online theological education initiative of the Minnesota and Wisconsin Conference's United Church of Christ. That is a mouthful, Stephanie. She teaches history as an affiliate faculty member at Garrett Seminary, and she's a tribal citizen of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, and an educator and consultant in Native history, cultures, and land acknowledgements. Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us to discuss the Future Home of the Living God. Now, a little tiny bit of background. We've learned that Louise Erdrich first wrote this story as a short story in 2001, following the election of George W. Bush, and at a time when she was pregnant with her own daughter. And then she returned to it in 2016 when the election of Donald Trump inspired her to open it up into a full novel. And so the political scene of our country, the United States, is very, very much a part of the genesis, the gestation, and the delivery, I should say, of this particular novel. But I want to lift up a few themes that Stephanie have talked about, and I have talked about a little bit, and just hear from Stephanie. What, Stephanie, would you like to focus in on, particularly with your identity as a person deeply embedded in theology, a person associated with the Cherokee Nation, and a woman? What would you like to lift up about this book?
Thank you, Alison. I reread this book this summer and happened to be reading it when I was in Minnesota. I worked for both the Minnesota and Wisconsin conferences, UCC. I went to college in Minnesota, so did my husband. He's from Minnesota, and I actually grew up in Nebraska. And so we were up in Minnesota partly for my work and partly with family. And so that setting of South Minneapolis and of the Minnesota landscape and the Minnesota regulations was familiar to me. One of the things that Cedar noted in passing was when it had been so many years since the last snow. And it had routinely been 90 degrees or hotter in Minneapolis in the summers in the setting of the novel. And the truth is that this last winter was Minnesota's first winter without significant snow. And that summer was an unbearably hot summer in Minnesota. And this summer has not been as hot, but it has been hotter than normal. So, you know, I just had the sense of reading this novel in Minnesota about things happening in Minnesota and thinking, yeah, these things are happening. This is not just fiction, you know, this is the truth. Obviously, in this political moment in our nation, reading it this time around after the overturning of Roe v. Wade, Cedar's reproductive freedom or lack of it was really foregrounded for me. And I suspect that might be true for a lot of readers, but I would not want us to miss some of what I would think of as the native themes that really only kind of a native author, I think, could note and do so with some real clarity and realism, but also sometimes with some humor.
Right.
So, you know, Cedar is this adopted child, and she kind of notes tongue in cheek that she's kind of a disappointment to her white liberal community because she's not really spiritual and she doesn't have any special powers. And, you know, any Native person reading this book gets that in the sense that, you know, there's often this kind of stereotype associated with our identity or an expectation. I think the way that the author treats the intersection of Native and in this case Roman Catholic spirit. And
Yeah.
thank you, Terry, who, you know, is on my wall, if you could see my wall here above my desk in my home, is interesting. And she's never heavy-handed with any of these themes so much that you might sometimes miss the nuances of them. I think she injects a certain amount of humor when she takes us to the reservation the first time and Cedar meets her wife, her birth mom, and her extended res family. And, you know, from the casino to the convenience store they're running to the stepsister, there's some realism about methamphetamine use on the reservation, about poverty, about alcoholism, about smoking, about ill health. And there is still this portrayal of what's left of tribal sovereignty and an enduring and resilient community in the midst of that I really appreciated. And the second thread along this kind of Native arc is that early in the book, Cedar is reflecting on her birth parents or her adopted parents, excuse me, and she says something like, how did I even get to be adopted by these people anyway? Isn't
Right.
the Indian Child Welfare Act, which, you know, is a piece of legislation dating from the 1980s that seeks to keep Native children in Native families
Right.
because Native nations have sovereignty over their children.
Right.
And this is a reaction that legislation, which was contested, by the way, all the way to the Supreme Court last fall. That legislation in and of itself speaks to generation after generation of Native women who did not have autonomy over their reproductive choices, who were forcibly sterilized, whose children were removed from them, sent to tribal boarding schools, this legacy of trying to break down Native tribal communities and family systems. And so, I think there's a way that we can read this novel with a certain amount of shock of, oh my gosh, this is happening, or this could happen, this sense that women could either be forced to bear children or their children could be taken away. And the truth is, many of those things have been happening in Native communities since contact.
Exactly.
So I just think that's an important theme to lift up, that that's lurking in the background here. And I don't think the author is particularly heavy-handed with it, which I appreciate.
Yeah. Yeah, that's such good language around it, that is lurking in the background. I mean, in some ways, the author is just telling you the story from her perspective and what she knows. And in some ways, we talked a little bit about how the climate crisis is also sort of lurking in the background. It's never the subject of a sermon or a diatribe. It's just kind of the environment that the story is happening in. And I think that that's one of the things I so appreciate about the skill of this author, is that those emotions of like, oh, am I shocked? Oh, I shouldn't be shocked. Oh, why am I shocked? All happen because of the placement of this in a particular setting and in a particular way.
Yeah, and I think, as we said last week, or when we talked to each other recently, climate change is in the back of this. And then I think there's that kind of, again, not heavy-handed, but the question arises as we go through the narrative is how one thing informs the other. So there's climate change, there's this sense that humans may be de-evolving, and the whole, to question the whole kind of Western modernist notion of progress. Is progress what we mean by that? And then there's the martial law and the scarcity of goods. And, I think that there is, if we were in an academic setting, we'd call this intersectionality. In this novel, I think these things are just really they're woven together, but they're not fully explained.
Yes. I wonder if that's a frustration to some readers, because I know the novel has been criticized for sort of leaving a lot of unanswered questions, but one of the things I really appreciated about the novel is that it held uncertainty in such an alive way. I mean, in an energizing way. And having come through the pandemic fairly recently, I think all of us have had experiences of uncertainty that perhaps we couldn't have articulated before the pandemic. And then you speak about, you lifted up some of the words from Eddie about how, in fact, this is how Native people have lived for a very long time. The resilience and the uncertainty, the oppression and the self-determination. I'm just curious how you felt, sort of like the balance came out in the novel of all of those different themes.
I did. I think I said to you and Madeline, the three of us got together for a kind of, prep for this. And I said, at the point in the story where Cedar makes it up to the reservation the second time, is on fleeing, and her adoptive mother, has been in the hospital/jail, and they make it up to the res. Eddie, the stepfather, notes that there are a lot of Native veterans, which is true. Natives serve per capita more than any other group in the country in the armed forces. And that the natives know what they're doing, the Native veterans, and that they've raided the National Guard Armory at Fort Ripley. And so they are patrolling and guarding the boundaries of the reservation, which is sovereign territory. And so I got all excited. I thought, all right, she's going to have the baby on the breast. They're going to protect the borders. They're holding out. And of course, they can't. And that is also the repeated historical story, right? That the US government always finds a way onto native land and always erodes native sovereignty. And that sovereignty is, unprotected in every generation and has to be fought for. So I was both kind of cheering and hopeful, and then, obviously those hopes are dashed by more realism. But in the midst of that, Eddie says something like, Indians have been adapting since 1492. And it made me think of another book by Steve Charleston, who's an Episcopal priest, he's Choctaw Nation. And the title of the book is We Survived the End of the World, Lessons on Apocalypse and Hope. And so I think that she does fictitiously what other Native authors do in nonfiction, which is to kind of just allude to the fact that the world has been ending for a long time in Native America. And she doesn't really tidily tie up that theme. In fact, the world really does end poorly for Cedar, in the midst of that, and not just for Native folks, for all the women in the prison in Stillwater that we hear about in those final scenes. But yet, Cedar articulates late in the novel that she still has joy and she still has hope. And for me, I had to read that as, I can't necessarily hope for myself, but I can hope because of my ancestors, and I can hope for the next generations.
Yes. Yeah.
I hope more collectively, even beyond the bounds of, chronological time. So those things struck me, Alison.
That's such an evolution of Cedar's character through the book, because I mean she starts out as kind of a superficial character and sort of bound up in the moment, and she acts out and she has sort of little hissy fits and and going through this experience, her determination somehow shifts her worldview, her focus. And as you say, I think she places herself in the stream of ancestors and descendants in a really different way. And her individuality begins to sort of morph, and she's almost more saint-like. I mean, there are a lot of similarities between Cedar and Kateri in the ways in which the forbearance that comes forward, and the sense of I am here not just for me, I'm here for a much larger purpose. Yeah.
Yeah, and no, I don't want to give any spoilers, but that question of how she did get adopted out, and I think she gets some answers to some questions of her identity late in the book as well.
Yeah.
Which, just following along that line that you say, that we see her mature and put some pieces together for herself.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I see that some folks have been dropping some comments and some questions in the chat, which is great. We will get to those in our Q&A time. But first, we're going to move into some small groups so we can have a little bit deeper conversations about this book. And Madeline, how do you feel about being ready to do that?
I feel good, Alison.
Great. So we are going to take what you've read and what Stephanie has offered in this conversation to consider as we transition into small group discussions. And of course, Madeline has been preparing these based on your response in the chat about how far you've gotten the book. Hopefully we haven't given too many spoilers in our first conversation here. And she's going to put a few prompts in the chat that are meant as inspiration for your conversation, but of course, go anywhere that you would like to in your conversation. We'll bring you back shortly after 12:50 Eastern time, so 50 minutes after the hour. So you'll have about 25 minutes in breakout rooms. And on your return, you'll have an opportunity to share more questions and wonderings in the chat. And then we'll turn to those as we continue this great conversation with Stephanie. So the person who most recently celebrated their birthday is invited to be a gentle facilitator for your group, keeping an eye on the time and inviting all who wish to speak. And don't forget to briefly introduce yourselves to one another. Have a great conversation. We're looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
June, do you see a room for you to go in? You're on mute, honey. If not, I can put you somewhere for sure. Let's see. Oh, there she goes. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording.
Hello and welcome back, everyone. So as you return from breakout groups and we're preparing for a time of continuing conversation with our guest, the Reverend Stephanie Perdew, I want to give you just a couple of minutes in the shared quiet during which you can share some of your continued wonderings in the chat. So please go ahead and share your additional questions now. And we'll be watching the chat and we'll aim to discuss as many of the topics as you raise as we possibly can. So just take a moment in the quiet, let you absorb what you've just been a part of and put out some thoughts in the chat. So Stephanie, I know that there were a couple of questions that happened even before people went through into breakout rooms. I wondered if any of those caught your eye.
Well, Dawn had noted this comment about nothing happening in a silo. And I think the kind of momentum for me of reading this fictitious storytelling that left it open-ended enough for us to wonder, how did it get this way? What has happened? You know, and there was a kind of acceleration of that. Now there's a run on the banks. Now food is getting more scarce. And that those strands of freedoms and access to resources and what's happening in the climate just, you know, seem to be woven together.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. The intertwining, the interweaving that happens there. And that sort of ties into another question we've been wondering about is this an example of climate fiction? And do you think that reading this might help somebody facing the real life realities of climate change in our world today? Do you think that there's some sort of preparatory aspect of this book?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I don't know genre-wise where this fits necessarily, but certainly for me, and the three of us were talking, we had our own kind of chat, you know, while you all were in breakout rooms, and each of us talked about the sense of coming away from the book, thinking about our own preparedness or lack of preparedness, or resiliency, or would we have the courage to adapt, evolve, maybe even quickly adapt. Things that feel more and more realistic, you know, that these things could happen to us in the near future. And can we make those adaptations ourselves? So in that sense, I think I certainly was reading it with this sense of what are the dominoes, as Don was suggesting. As the climate evolves, what are the dominoes? And what is my sense of where I'm going to be able to find my own resiliency or adaptivity in the midst of that?
Right. It's sort of an idea of where does this begin? And we touched beforehand on that conversation about progress and modernism, and how modernism has sort of imbued us with the story of progress onward and onward and upward forever. And what happens, what is progress anyway? And what happens when things don't behave in that way?
I mean, progress is kind of based on the sense that things will continue to evolve in a good way. And there are unlimited resources, which we know there are not. You know, in some resources are finite. Somebody touches on this. Oh, Mary Beth says, you know, we talk about evolution reversing itself, which is hinted at. And she's saying, was that a background? Is this significant on its own? I mean, I think one of the criticisms of this book is that there's a lot hanging out there that isn't, you know, maybe woven back together in a satisfactory. I began to wonder, is this more intentional on the author's part than I thought it was at first? And to leave us kind of sitting uncomfortably with that question of, I mean, if other systems can devolve, why can't human beings devolve?
Yeah, exactly. And it's just, she sort of leaves a question mark hanging over that in a very provocative way. And that's, we were talking about this earlier, it's sort of her style in this book is to point at things. Like, look over there and see that, and look over there and see that. And what is it that you're going to make of that as a reader, but also as somebody who's living into this future?
And I think that she hints, maybe it's when she's talking about the fact that there are insects and animals appearing that are unique or different. And maybe I'm making this up, but I feel like she hinted at the idea of the author that some of this had to do with toxicity or with, you know, other, you know, so when we think about devolving, we have to, I think, then think about what has the human impact been, you know, that would essentially send things in another direction than they were going, and kind of tip the scale, I guess. So, so much. Let's see. Yeah, and I think, Don, you raise a great question, which is related to that question of progress. Because, you know, who are we to decide what is evolution and what is devolution or devolution?
Yeah. I'm wondering, Jessica is asking about the image of Seela being impregnated by an angel, and I sort of have that connected in my mind with Wendy putting something in the chat before the breakout rooms about God's action in the world, and the use of a baby to describe activity, to describe faith, to describe promise and hope. I'm curious about what your read of that, of some of the religious imagery that is embedded in this book.
I was really captivated by that, and I wondered how much Cedar's interpretation of that was connected to this Catholic faith that she found,
Mhm.
her teen life or early adulthood, or, at a certain point that she tells us about. And also during break, we were talking about the character of the baby's human father, Phil, I think his name is.
Mhm, mhm.
So ambivalent about him that I can't remember his name. So both there's this sense that she's impregnated by this angel, and then there's the sense that if he's an angel, he's really fallen by,
At the end of the book, right? Yes.
or maybe we're seeing that humanity and divinity, I don't know, in more historical, Christological terms, show up. But I will admit, I don't know what to make of that.
Mhm.
She trying to make him out better than he was by imagining that he was an angel. Was she really impregnated by an angel?
Mhm, mhm.
And, riff on the nativity story going on here where Phil is in more of the Joseph character, I guess, and
Right, right.
he's the human father that shows up, although different than Joseph in that he doesn't seem to protect her very well. So, I mean, I could go back and reread this just for those kind of
Yes.
possible themes, and the whole thing was Saint Kateri and the shrine and something.
And the devotion to Kateri and the way in which Kateri and the female leadership of the tribe sort of go hand in hand in those scenes. I think, is this counterpoint of women's empowerment, female empowerment, up and against everything else that's going on.
Oh, June says he was a costume they wore at church, right? Or something.
Right, they were in a closet of costumes.
I didn't.
But yes, exactly. I'm thinking that's one answer, but I think she opens it up for so many different interpretations and answers that are possible.
June also said she's reminded of some other things. Margaret Wheatley's Islands of Sanity, Debris, Refugia, Deb will be your speaker at convocation.
Mhm.
In other words, the kind of sense of what are all of us going to have to do, or what can we do where we are with the people we're with, right now, and what are those? I mean, for me, the reservation showed up as one of those communities. But even in the hospital where Sarah, Cedar's adoptive mother, shows up, and in the first part of the book, she's portrayed as frankly this kind of flaky white liberal, South Minneapolis woman who hasn't vaccinated her child, and blah blah blah. And then she's in the hospital helping people escape, using her midwifery skills in very catastrophic situations. And there is a way in which the male characters, there aren't that many of them to begin with, but they really recede into the background. And Eddie kind of comes forward as more sensible than you think he is up on the reservation. But, for the most part, the baby's father, Cedar's adoptive father, show up in these kind of unhelpful or absent ways, I guess.
It's true. And Eddie starts out as not a very promising character. I mean, he's writing to keep himself alive so that he doesn't, choose to end his life, which is a very odd framing. But on the other hand, when he really steps up, he steps up fully and completely, and with not just courage, but wit.
Yeah.
And yeah, he becomes a fully rounded character, definitely. Yeah.
And Dory points out, and yet the personalized evil is this mother, this, you know, the female mother, the mother capital M, who is like the big brother, you know, in the Orwell.
Yes, yeah, exactly, exactly. What other question may be intriguing to you here? There's so many that are coming in here now in comments.
I want to get to Wendy with Brian McLaren.
Mm,
No, I don't want to go there quite yet. Okay, and then John is giving us a little more about this angel. That we have the angel, the guardian, and the angel of proportion. Which
yeah,
are we going to do?
I'll just put in a plug that we will be actually doing a book group on Brian McLaren's book coming up in the fall, and he will also be with us in a public conversation. So thank you for raising that book, and it's on our radar and coming soon.
I'm going to join Nicole from BTS in doing those sessions, the free sessions with the book. So I have it sitting here and I haven't read it, but I intend to read it.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Exactly. I wonder if we just want to go back to oh, here we have Phil as the role of the protector. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah, I think Margaret, you're raising some great complicated questions that he was more protective earlier in the novel, and that we can't forget that he was tortured or went through some very harrowing experience of his own. And that the interest in Cedar's baby, as well as these other babies who on ultrasound appear normal, is, you know, very possibly part of his motivation. I mean, does he think that life will be preserved? Or does he think that collaborating will, you know, in some way?
Mhm.
And Margaret, I appreciate you looking up this. So like if we're working with this angel metaphor, which I admit that's a thread that was really not, I was not tuning into that in either reading of this book that I did. But thinking of him as this kind of quasi-angelic being who's really struggling with the choices he's making
Mhm.
is helpful to help me round him out as a more empathetic character, I think. Great insights in that.
I wonder if we want to round it out here by just returning to one of the questions that folks engaged with in their breakout groups was, where was God or spirit for you in this story? And where was God or spirit absent? I wonder, Stephanie, if you want to take us out on that meditation.
Well, I probably would really resonate with this long quote we posted it, Wendy, one of the Wendy's, about the baby, you know, that God is doing things in quiet ways. And I felt for me in reading the novel that God was kind of showing up in these moments where Cedar lived more and more fully into her pregnancy and found ways to be ingenuous.
Mhm.
Women were trying to protect other women, or Phil was trying to protect Cedar, or the reservation was trying to protect its nation, or, you know, how was God showing up? Even in the face of what seems as the momentum of the novel develops, it seems like there's no fighting this, you know, resistance is futile. I mean, the drones that can see everything everywhere and the pesticides and, you know, bumblebees. But my sense of where God was, I think, I mean, there's a longer historical arc here, and I think Alison and I were talking about this at the break too, that I think one of the reasons Erdrich is able to tell a story like this, and certain authors are able to tell stories like these, is even if they are kind of dystopian or speculative, they're based on certain historical experiences that, you know, Native communities have routinely run out of food or been starved or had food rationing. You know, rights have routinely been.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm able to place God in the midst of that narrative, even if it, and I think these, like Sarah's midwifery
Yeah.
was very much a God moment.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, God in relationship and God in creativity. And
Trying to preserve freedom and trying to preserve life in whatever shape that can take in these moments.
exactly. Exactly. Yeah, I felt God's presence through the whole novel. And very rarely the absence, but yeah. Exactly. Yep, even in a pile of dirty clothes, absolutely, Dawn. Wow, I'm so grateful for these questions, for this exchanges that are happening, these comments that are happening in the chat. If you all know how to hold onto the chat by clicking the three little dots at the bottom of the chat, you can save the chat so you can go back and see some of these dialogues back and forth. But Stephanie, thank you so much for being our guest and our guide as we navigated Future Home of the Living God by Louise Erdrich. And I hope you've enjoyed all of this time together as much as I have. And I think I speak for Madeline too. It's been wonderful. And if you'd like to continue to explore this fascinating and troubling novel, I commend to you this interview between Margaret Atwood and Louise Erdrich. I'm going to put this in the chat. You can listen to it or you can read it, and I found it incredibly moving. So now, Madeline.
Yes, hi. Let's see if I can spotlight myself. Here we are. Oh, there's my face. Hello. Hello. Thank you all so, so much. And Alison and Stephanie. Yeah, so rich. I'm really grateful to deep dive into this book with you all and with you both. I want to invite each of you to our final session on August 27th, which like summer is flying. I don't know if that feels that way for all of you. But we're going to be exploring the tome that is Cloud Cuckoo Land by Anthony Doerr. Also, we're developing discussion guides for each of the 3 books we're engaging with this summer. And our hope is that some of you might want to bring Northwoods and Future Home of the Living God and Cloud Cuckoo Land to your neighborhood book club or congregation or community, and that these discussion guides will make that extra doable for you. I'm going to put convocation in the chat. Many of you are with us often and frequently, so you probably know, but if you don't, our next big event on the horizon is Convocation, and this is the BTS Center's annual legacy event. This year, we're focused on hope in small places, becoming people of refugia faith, with keynote speaker Deborah Rienstra and Reverend Mariama White-Hammond, along with creative and contemplative immersion opportunities, Lectio Terra, Bible study and affinity groups, and much, much more. Please consider joining us in person in Hallowell, Maine, or for the online companion, which I will be leading with Peterson Toscano. So come on down, near or far, and you can learn more from that link in the chat and register there too. So with that, I will say adieu to Alison and Stephanie and all of you, and I hope that you all go in peace as inspired fiction readers, and many, many blessings to each of you, my friends. Thank you.